Good afternoon. We thank you for joining with us for this Bible study from Ezra chapter 3, verses 1 through 11. It has a very fitting title, Worship Before Work. The key verse this week is with praise and thanksgiving they sang to the Lord. He is good. His love toward Israel endures forever. I know this title brings about some questions because I know in our world today we all work many unusual schedules, different times, all days of the week. But the theme of this lesson is no matter when we work, worship always needs to be our priority. That doesn't even always mean we can be gathered in God's house, but it does mean we can keep worship first in our life. And worship can take many different forms besides just the time that we're together in the sanctuary. The people of Israel have been given a major assignment by the King Darius of the Persian Empire. He felt led by the Spirit of God to authorize the people of Israel to rebuild the temple that had been torn down by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon several years earlier. The Israelites had been taken captive to Babylon, but as leader of Persia, the king felt that not only was he commanded by God to do this, but in addition, it would build goodwill with those he hoped to continue to rule over by letting them go to their homes, rebuild their places of worship, and if he participated and helped them, it would also help in their loyalty to him. They were given a job of going back to rebuild the temple that had been destroyed over a half century earlier. It was going to be a daunting task to rebuild what had been torn down. But this was the commission of the ruling powers. And the people of Israel jumped at the chance to return. It was significant, not only were they rebuilding something that had been special to them, but they were also rebuilding a primary symbol of Israel's relationship with God. The temple stood as a secure sign that God was with his people, and it served to remind both the people and even other nations of the covenant that had existed between the people of Israel and their God. In Ezra chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, we read, "When the 7th month came, and the Israelites were in the towns, the people gathered together in Jerusalem. Then Jeshua, son of Jozadak, with his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, with his kin, set out to build the altar of the God of Israel, to offer burnt offerings on it, as prescribed in the law of Moses, the man of God. They set up the altar on its foundation because they were in dread of the neighboring peoples, and they offered burnt offerings upon it to the Lord morning and evening. And they kept the festival of booths as prescribed, and offered the daily burnt offerings by number according to the ordinance as required for each day. And after that, the regular burnt offerings, the offerings at the new moon, and at all the sacred festivals of the Lord, and the offerings of everyone who made a freewill offering to the Lord. From the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, but the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid." The journey from Babylon, where the people had been captive, to go back to the land of Judea would have taken about 4 months. It was not an easy journey across the desert. It covered nearly 500 miles. They would have arrived about the 5th month of the year from the time of the emperor's edict. They started the construction of the altar at the beginning of the 7th month. That was significant. Before they started on the temple, they started on the altar, where the sacrifices and the acts of worship would be taken care of. The 7th month was very significant to the Israelites, as there were 3 major celebrations that took place. The first was the Feast of Trumpets. This marked the beginning of a new agricultural year for the people of Israel. The harvest was completed, the winter rains hadn't yet begun, and it was a time of celebration to thank the Lord for what he had provided in the previous year and trusting him for what he was going to provide in the coming year. It was a most holy time of observation in their lives. The second was the Feast of Atonement. This was a time of fasting and prayer for the sins of the community. They were willing to acknowledge their shortcomings and take time to reflect on what God would have them to do to live lives that would be pleasing to him. Also in the 7th month was the Feast of the Tabernacles. This was to remind the people of the time that they wandered in the wilderness. You may remember, after the Israelites were freed from bondage as slaves in Egypt, they were wandering in the wilderness for some time while God was revealing his law to them, while sin was being purged from them. They actually wandered a period of 40 years. And this Feast of Tabernacles was to remind them of the time that they spent with no real homeland, when they were just offering themselves to reflect on what had taken place in their past and what had enabled them to get to the place where they were. In order to celebrate these festivals, they rebuilt the altar of the Lord first. They didn't begin by building the building. They began by offering their sacrifices. They remembered that in the past, their freedom had been bought with a great price, and they were reflecting on that. They learned a very important element of what worship was supposed to be. Worship was to do 2 very important things for them, and I believe should do the same for us today. Worship reminds us of God's goodness in the past. How critical that is to remember what God has done for us. But our spirituality is not something from the past. It also, we need to remember what he has done in the past so we can reclaim it for the present. That is why Israel started not with the building, but with the altar where the sacrifices would be made. How many times should we be doing that in our own heart? Moving on to Ezra 3, verses 7 through 9, we read, "So they gave money to the masons and the carpenters, and food, drink, and oil to the Sidonians, and the Tyrians to bring cedar trees from Lebanon to the sea, to Joppa according to the grant they had from King Cyrus of Persia. Foundation laid for the temple in the 2nd year after their arrival in the house of God at Jerusalem, in the 2nd month, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, son of Jozadak, made a beginning together with the rest of their people. the priests and the Levites, and all who had come to Jerusalem from the captivity. They appointed the Levites from 20 years old and upward to have oversight of the work on the house of the Lord. And Jeshua with his sons and his kin, and Kadmiel and his sons, Binnui and Hodaviah, along with the sons of Henadad, the Levites, their sons and kin, together took charge of the workers in the house of God. Worship at the altar in Jerusalem inspired the people to work on the temple. It didn't go the other way around. The more they worshiped, the more they had the burden for what needed to be done for the temple to be rebuilt. Under the leadership of Joshua and Zerubbabel, the building commenced. This, of course, is not the same Joshua that succeeded Moses, but Joshua was a common name at that time in history. But it's very significant that the leadership of Joshua and Zerubbabel, they represented the union of both political and spiritual leadership. What an important concept. In their particular case, Joshua was a descendant of David, Zerubbabel the priest, and the two together represented political leadership, those who were building the nation, and spiritual leadership that was strengthening the values of the people. What an example that would be in our world today, to see instead of spiritual and political at odds with each other, to see a union where the political was seeking the peace of God, as well as the spiritual, instead of being always critical, always finding fault, to work together for the building of the kingdom. I know we have a long way to go in our world today to see that happen, but what a blessing that would be. The building activity could be considered an extension of Israel's worship. Do we ever think about that? We often think worship means, as they did, sacrifices, song, but instead of going through what would be considered the routine acts of worship, instead, the building of the temple became an outpouring. It became an act of worship in that they were fulfilling what God had told them to do, fulfilling what God had provided for them to do, and enabling them to really be faithful in doing something for his kingdom. In Ezra 3, verses 10 to 11, we read, "When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments were stationed to praise the Lord with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, according to the directions of King David of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. And the people responded with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid." The Jewish leaders held a formal worship service to celebrate the beginning of the new temple. At this point, they emphasized the faithfulness of God who brought them to this point. They knew they were poor exiles in a foreign land, and now not only the ruling authorities had provided a way for them to go home, but they were also able to rebuild that special temple, which had been so special to each of their hearts. And they emphasized the faithfulness of God who brought them to this point. It wasn't their efforts that rebuilt the temple. It wasn't their strength, or for that matter, even their faithfulness that rebuilt the temple. It was the emphasis on the faithfulness of God who had brought them to this point. The stones that were laid declared God's commitment to his people through all generations. God's commitment never ends. We deal with a lot of people in the world today who are committed to something for a brief period of time. But thankfully, we can say the power of God reaches out faithfully to all generations. He will never get weary with us. He may get weary of some of our actions, but he will never be wearied with us as individuals. He will never love us less. He will never look for someone else to go on to. The stones, just as they lay there stationary unless they're acted on by some very significant force, remain solid. And so does God's commitment to his people. What a blessing and heritage we have been given. I realize normally when we study a Sunday school lesson or Bible study, we spend time discussing. And I realize that we cannot do this in this format, but just a couple questions I'd like us to consider, and something that we might think about in our own hearts as we conclude this lesson today. Do you think that prayer is a first step or a last resort for most people? The unfortunate thing is, many times, I've even heard the phrase used in church, and I know we mean well, but it's like, when all else fails, try prayer. But you know what? If we wait that long, we've almost reached a point of failing. Prayer should not be after we've done everything else we know to do. Prayer should really be the beginning point before we start thinking about what we need to do. Perhaps we wouldn't be at some of the last resorts that people find themselves in if we had spent more time preparing in the first place. And without being too hard, perhaps we should all reflect. Do we put prayer first, or do we wait until we exhaust all of our own resources and then, okay, God, I could use a little help here? God doesn't want us to make prayer the last resort. He wants us to communicate with him so we can constantly be in touch with what his will is. One final question: what do you think the results of building the altar before the rest of the church building would be in the world today? How many times do we focus on the physical building? How many times do we focus on sometimes even legitimate things, how many people we can come in contact with? But the real element of the strength of God's church is not in what we have, not in what we do, but in how much in communion with him we are. Now I realize that altars take different forms in different centers of worship, and that's okay. The real key is, do we have a place that we meet God first? And should not that be the primary element of everything that we do in trying to build his kingdom? I realize that there are challenges in the world around us, but let's make sure we're focused on the right thing first. Let's build our altar to him first. Let's spend time in prayer with him first. Let's be honest, everything that Israel did should have been impossible. But they succeeded. Why? Because they were commissioned by God. They were committed to prayer, and they followed his direction day by day. May we live by those principles in our lives. Let's bow for a moment of prayer. Precious Heavenly Father, as we call upon your name this afternoon, we thank you for the love that you have shown to each and every one of us. We know that we do need more of your love and help day by day. We know that there are many challenges in the world around us. But we would just ask that we would always be reminded to keep you first, to first build the altar, to first commit our hearts, to be committed to follow your instruction, and then we will receive the blessing. Will you just pour out of yourself upon us? We ask also for a blessing. We know that our country at this time is going through a very difficult place, both with the physical COVID-19 virus and with all the racial tensions going on in the communities around us. We know that these things are almost as impossible for us as rebuilding the temple would have been for the people of Israel. May we find your peace. May we share your peace and walk closely in the light of your will. Your holy name we do ask it.